The night Aries decided Saren Novak wasn't a threat, he did something he hadn't done in 4 years. He sat down. Not because anyone commanded him, not from exhaustion or sedation or worn-down instinct. He sat down because a 22-year-old medical assistant in second-hand scrubs had lowered herself to the cold tile of examination room 3, extended the back of her hand at a distance of exactly 6 feet, and begun talking, quietly, steadily, about how she'd always hated fluorescent lighting, how the flicker of it gave her a headache by 9 o'clock, how the clinic waiting room had the worst she'd ever seen, the kind that hummed at a frequency that lived behind your eyes. She wasn't talking to the room. She wasn't performing calm. She was just talking, and the dog was listening. And after about 90 seconds of this, 110 pounds of black German shepherd, with blood matted in his coat and a gash above his left eye, quietly folded himself onto the floor and exhaled. The 3 men who'd been trying to restrain him for the past 20 minutes went absolutely still. And Zane Harmon, standing in the doorway with his jacket open and his face arranged into the same expression it wore during board meetings and gunfights alike, said nothing, just watched. That was the moment. That was the crack in the foundation. Nobody knew it yet, but it was there. The Meridian Medical Center had no website, no listed phone number, and no walk-in hours. It occupied the 4th floor of the Grandview Hotel's East Tower, accessible by a private elevator that required a key card and a 6-digit code that changed every 72 hours. The suites on that floor smelled of antiseptic and expensive cologne, and the patients who arrived, usually after midnight, usually in need of things that couldn't be asked about at a hospital with a reporting obligation, paid in cash, were treated without questions, and left the same way they came. Saren Novak had been working there for 8 months. She'd found the job through a friend of a friend, the kind of connection that existed precisely because the clinic needed staff who were good and quiet and desperate enough not to ask about the man who had his jaw reconstructed in Suite 4B or the woman who needed 3 units of blood replaced, and gave her name as Patricia, in a tone that suggested she'd invented that name approximately 4 seconds earlier. Saren was good and quiet. The desperate part had arrived after her grandmother's nephrologist used the phrase aggressive progression in a calm, clinical voice, and Saren had nodded and then gone to her car afterward and sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes, staring at the steering wheel doing arithmetic. She was not, in any meaningful sense, part of the criminal world. She was a girl with excellent patient instincts, steady hands, and a student loan balance that sat on her chest like something physical, and she had made the practical decision that treating undocumented gunshot wounds paid significantly better than treating sprained ankles at the urgent care on 5th Street. She had not anticipated Aries. He'd been brought in just after 1 in the morning, carried by 2 men who looked like they'd rather be doing absolutely anything else. The dog had a 6-inch laceration across his flank from broken glass during what she would later learn was an ambush on Zane Harmon's motorcade, an ambush that had killed 2 drivers, injured 4 of Harmon's men, and left Aries, who had thrown himself in front of the door panel when the window shattered, bleeding and furious, and translating his pain directly into controlled, methodical aggression. He had already bitten one of the men carrying him. The improvised bandage on the man's forearm was a necktie. Saren's supervisor took one look at the dog, said something under his breath that sounded like a prayer, and stepped back. The clinic's veterinary contact wasn't answering his phone. "He won't let anyone near him," said the man with the necktie bandage, holding his arm like evidence. "He snapped at Dr. Price. We need him sedated." "Where's the sedative?" "It requires someone to get close enough to inject it." Saren looked at the dog. Aries was backed against the far wall, one rear leg braced at a bad angle, blood tracking in a slow line across the tile. His hackles ran from his neck to the base of his tail. His eyes were moving, cataloging the room, counting threats, doing the math of survival with the focused precision of an animal who'd had that math trained into him from puppyhood. He was afraid, under all of it, the aggression, the teeth, the positioned weight. Saren could see it clearly. This dog was in pain, and he didn't know where the next threat was coming from. and every person who'd rushed at him in the last 20 minutes had confirmed his belief that rushing meant more pain. She didn't rush. She sat down cross-legged on the floor, about 6 feet away, and let herself be exactly as unthreatening as she actually was. "I hate these lights," she said to the air. "There's a hum to them that gets behind your eyes after a few hours. The waiting room ones are worse." Aries watched her, didn't move. "It's cold in here too. They keep it cold for sterile reasons, which makes sense, but 58 degrees is excessive." She extended the back of her hand, not reaching, just offering it as a fact. "Here is my hand. It belongs to me. It's not moving toward you." She kept talking. The cracked window on her drive to work. The terrible coffee the night shift always made. The way exam room 3 smelled faintly of the eucalyptus cleaner they used on Tuesdays. 90 seconds in, Aries sat down. The weapon readiness shifted into something closer to watchfulness. He was trying to decide. She gave him more time, then shifted her weight slowly forward and extended her hand another foot. He leaned toward it, sniffed. When her fingers found the fur behind his ear, moving gently the way her grandmother had always taught her, never gripping, just present, Aries turned his face into her palm and exhaled a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. The room was very quiet. "He's not aggressive," Saren said, her hands already moving carefully toward the flank wound. "He's terrified. There's a difference." A silence. Then, from the doorway, a voice she hadn't heard yet, low, controlled, the kind of voice that existed in its own register. "How did you do that?" She looked up. Zane Harmon was not what she'd expected, and she'd learned 8 months ago not to form expectations about who came through that elevator. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark suit that had survived a long and violent night through sheer structural will. Maybe 42. The scar cutting through his left cheek had healed long enough ago to be silver white in the clinic's bad lighting. His eyes were fixed on her, not on the dog. "I didn't do anything," Saren said, pressing gauze carefully against Aries' flank. "I just sat with him until he remembered he didn't have to be afraid of everything in the room." Something moved across Zane Harmon's face, briefly, almost imperceptibly. Not quite recognition, something older. "What's your name?" he asked. "Saren Novak." "How long have you worked here?" 8 months. He looked at her for another long moment. "You'll be here tomorrow night." Not a question. Subscribe right now and hit the bell, because what happened after that conversation was about to change Saren Novak's life in ways she couldn't have predicted on her best day. And Zane Harmon had just become the most dangerous kind of person in the world, the kind who pays attention. The offer came the next evening, delivered by a man in a gray suit who placed a manila envelope on the exam table and introduced himself only as Mr. Harmon's scheduling associate. Inside, a contract, a monthly retainer that made her blink twice, and a handwritten line at the bottom in precise angular script, "Primary care for Aries. On call. No other duties." Below that, one more line. "Your grandmother's treatment costs for the next 18 months. Handled. Effective immediately." Saren stood in the exam room for a long time after the man left. She thought about refusing. Spent a genuine 20 minutes imagining the version of her life where she handed the envelope back. She thought about it carefully and honestly. Then she thought about her grandmother sitting in a dialysis chair 3 days a week and the number in her checking account. She signed. The weeks that followed had a rhythm she hadn't anticipated. She came in 4 evenings a week, and Aries was always there. In the room adjacent to Harmon's private office, usually on a cedar bed that looked custom-built, alert but no longer combat-ready. He'd begun looking for her when she arrived. She could hear it from the hallway, the shift from lying down silence to feet on floor, a big dog orienting towards something familiar and safe. She didn't work with him through commands or obedience drills. She worked through presence, predictability, the same arrival time, the same quiet greeting, the same low voice explaining what she was about to do before she did it. She brought lavender oil balm for the scar tissue on his flank and applied it the same way every time, because he needed to know that being touched at that spot wasn't going to mean new pain. When he growled at a guard who moved too fast through the doorway, she put her hand flat on his side and said, "Easy, I see him, not a threat." And Ares, after a moment, looked at her face and made a decision based on what he found there. Within 2 weeks, he was doing it automatically, checking her face before reacting to anything, using her calm as a gauge for his own. Harmon appeared in the doorway one Thursday evening, watching. "He never let anyone near that wound," he said. "3 handlers tried. He bit the last one. He didn't know they weren't going to hurt him." She ran her thumb along the healing tissue, which had knitted clean. "He knows now." Harmon came into the room and settled into the chair in the corner, the same one he'd been gravitating toward on late evenings, when paperwork kept him at the Meridian, and it was easier to stay near Ares than not. Saren had started pretending not to notice this. It seemed important to him that nobody notice. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "Not the medical part, the other part." "My grandmother had a dog when I was a kid. Shelter dog, 2 years in. Couldn't be touched without flinching." She didn't look up from Ares. She sat with him on the back porch every morning for 6 weeks before he'd come to her. She said the most important thing you could give a frightened animal was proof that nothing bad would happen to it while you were there. The room settled into silence. "Ares was a military working dog," Harmon said eventually, his voice holding its neutrality with visible effort. "His handler was a Marine. Died 18 months after they came home. Ares went through 4 placements after that. None of them worked." "What happened with the last one?" "He bit a child. The family surrendered him to a pound." A pause. "I bought him out the next morning." Saren looked at him then. He was looking at the dog, at the easy sprawl of Ares's body, the slow rhythm of his breathing. "You saved him," she said. "I kept him alive." "That's the same thing, most of the time." His jaw tightened slightly. "He still wouldn't let me touch him for 8 months. She thought about what she knew of Zane Harmon. The things that assembled themselves in 8 months, whether you tried to overhear them or not. A man who had risen through the city's criminal hierarchy, through strategic precision and a complete willingness to do what others hesitated to do. A man who had been taught, very young, that sentiment was exploitable and mercy was a liability. She thought about a dog trained to associate every approach with combat or pain, spending years defending himself preemptively because that was the only math he knew. "You saved each other," she said quietly. "You just haven't figured out how to show him it's safe yet." "I don't generally make things safe," Harmon said, with a flatness that might have been self-awareness. "My whole value proposition is the opposite." She almost said, "I know, so can he, and he still trusted me before you did." Instead, she pressed the balm into Ares's scar one more time and let the silence do the work. Graham Vick arrived on a Wednesday. Saren knew the name before she saw the man, not because anyone had told her, but because of the way Ares reacted when the elevator opened on the 4th floor and the footsteps came down the hall. The dog went rigid, not the aggressive readiness of a manageable threat, something older, recognition laced with something that functioned very much like dread. Graham Vick was 70 years old and looked 60. Silver-haired, tailored, with the kind of face that appeared trustworthy until you noticed his eyes didn't participate in his smiles. He'd brought Zane Harmon into this life at 19, had taught him the rules by which power worked in this city, and the first and most important rule was, never give anyone a reason to believe they matter to you. He looked at Saren for exactly 3 seconds, the way you assess something to determine whether it's useful or problematic, and smiled warmly. "I see you've acquired a pet project," he said to Harmon, in the pleasant, avuncular tone of a man who understood that the worst things sound best delivered gently. "State your business, Graham." "My business is concern, the well-being of someone I helped build." He settled into a chair without being invited, adjusted his cuffs. "The families have noticed things, a shift in your priorities. My results are the same as they've always been." "Your results, yes. Your affect is different." Graham's gaze drifted to Saren and then to Ares, who had not looked away from the man since he entered. "You have a very calming presence, my dear. I can see the appeal. The question is whether Zane can afford it." He turned back to Harmon. "Sentiment, is a hole in the fence, son. Sooner or later, someone finds it. After he left, the room felt different. Harmon stood at the window, still, the way he went still when he was computing something he didn't want to compute. Aries pressed against Saren's leg, solid and warm. He came to warn you, she said. He came to remind me what I am. Harmon didn't turn. He's not wrong about the math. In this life, if something matters to you, it can be taken from you. She looked at him, at the set of his shoulders, at the exact posture of someone who had spent 23 years building walls and had just noticed a crack. He's wrong about one thing, she said. Harmon turned. He thinks the only power is the kind that scares people. But Aries has been afraid his whole life and it never kept him safe. She met Harmon's eyes. What keeps him safe now is trust. That's a different kind of strength. He looked at her for a long time, said nothing. That was the night he quietly added a second car to her evening escort home, without mentioning the first one. Hit the bell notification right now, because what Graham Vick said to his people that same night, in a suite 1 floor below, was that the girl was the fastest route to the clean shot he'd been waiting 3 years for, and he had already sent 2 men to her parking garage. She woke up in a warehouse. Her wrists were zip-tied to a metal folding chair. The smell was old concrete and rust, and the light through the roof panels was the gray of early morning. Graham Vick sat on an overturned crate across from her, reading something on his phone with the patient focus of a man with nowhere better to be. He looked up when she stirred. "Good morning," he said. "Zane will come. I'm counting on it. That's rather the point." He set his phone down. "He'll come because you matter to him," which is a sentence I genuinely didn't expect to say about Zane Harmon 18 months ago. But people surprise you. He folded his hands with the tidiness of a man who had never once been surprised by himself. "He'll come in off balance because you're in danger. My men will be ready for that version of him." Saren looked at him steadily. "You're going to lose," she said. Graham tilted his head slightly, the way a polite person responds to something mildly absurd. "He's not going to come in off balance," she said. "You think he will because you think I'm the important variable. But you're wrong about what he's learned." "And what has he learned?" She didn't answer, partly because she didn't fully know yet, partly because the answer was still arriving. The warehouse door opened at 4 in the morning. Cleanly, the locking mechanism bypassed with the precision of someone who had spent considerable time on the other side of locked doors. Harmon moved through with 3 of his men, weapons up, working through the space with a systematic efficiency that was the opposite of desperation. Not a man who had come unhinged. A man who had been doing math since the moment his phone rang. Aries came through 12 seconds later. The dog moved differently in this space, low, focused, nose down for 4 seconds until he found her scent, and then he was moving diagonally across the floor, and his eyes came up and found her and his tail moved once, just once. The way it did when he confirmed a locate. Graham's men opened fire on Harmon. Harmon moved through it, using columns, broken machinery, angles, 3 of Graham's 5 men down in 90 seconds. Then Graham stood up from behind the crate, and the knife in his hand caught the gray light from the roof panels. And he had Saren's chair from behind, and the blade was at the zip ties at her wrists before anyone had moved. "Stand down," he said pleasantly, "or we have a very different morning." Harmon stopped, gun raised, face nothing, just the calculation. This was the moment Graham had designed, the weakness in the fence, the thing that mattered, pressed against a blade. Saren looked at Aries. The dog was 5 feet away, positioned between her and the 2 remaining gunmen, and he was watching her face, not Graham, not Harmon, her, waiting. She understood then what 8 weeks of trust building had actually produced, and she understood what he was waiting for. "Aries," she said, her voice was completely level, "cover." He'd learned that command in another life, a military life, with a handler and a leash and a mission overseas. He hadn't used it in 3 years, but the command lived in him the way certain things do, beneath the trauma and the disuse and the 4 failed placements. He didn't go for Graham. He moved wide, arcing around the room's perimeter and positioned himself between the two remaining gunmen and the line of sight to Harmon, cutting their angle with his body, forcing them back or into a shot that risked hitting the dog. 2 seconds of hesitation. Graham felt the shift, the room rebalancing. His grip on the chair loosened a fraction as his brain recalculated. Harmon fired once. The knife hit the concrete. Graham's hand went to his forearm, and he sat down hard against the wall, and the remaining men, without a clear angle and with Ares between them and everything, made the correct assessment and stood very still. The room went quiet. Harmon crossed it in 6 steps and cut the zip ties from Saren's wrists, and when she stood her legs were steady, which she was glad about. He kept himself between her and Graham, gun lowered but in hand. "Finish it," Graham said from the wall. He was pale, bleeding, and his voice was still controlled. She'd grant him that. "You know what I know. You know what I'll do when I regroup." Harmon raised the gun. Saren stepped between them. He looked at her. His eyes moved to her face and stopped there. "He's done," she said quietly. "You heard him. If you finish it tonight, that's the story the families remember. Zane Harmon came for his medic, left a body, clean exchange." She held his gaze. "That's a story about a man who operates exactly the way Graham taught him to." She paused. "If you walk out with him alive, that's a different story. That's a story about a man who was already so far ahead that killing him wasn't even necessary." Something moved through Harmon's expression. She turned to Graham. "You told him sentiment was a hole in the fence," she said. "You were right that it's an opening. You were wrong about what comes through it." She looked at the silver-haired man on the wall, the grandfather's face, the shark's eyes, and behind the controlled expression she saw something she hadn't anticipated. A man who had built his entire sense of self on a philosophy that had just visibly failed to produce its promised result. "You spent 50 years teaching people that fear is the only reliable currency. Tonight you lost to a dog who learned how to trust somebody." Graham said nothing. "Go to Arizona," she said, "or wherever people go when this life is finished with them. Just go." A long silence. Then Harmon lowered the gun. 3 months later, Ares had a new habit. He slept on the waiting room couch on his back, legs loose in the air, in a posture of such profound shamelessness that the first business associate who walked past stopped walking entirely, stared for several seconds, and quietly recalibrated everything he thought he knew about Zane Harmon's legendary, terrifying guard dog. Saren thought that was probably good. Her role at the Meridian had shifted by degrees so gradual she hadn't noticed until it had already happened. Sitting in on certain conversations because her read on people had turned out to be a useful second opinion, and Harmon had quietly started factoring it in. He'd also, without mentioning it, upgraded her grandmother's dialysis transport to a car service. She'd noticed on the 3rd week and said nothing, because she was learning when silence was its own kind of answer. One evening in October, Harmon came into the waiting room with 2 cups of coffee, made correctly, because Saren had finally convinced the night staff, and sat across from her, and Ares cracked one eye open and then closed it again. "Graham sent a message," Harmon said, "through an intermediary. He's in Scottsdale, teaching firearms safety at a private range." Saren set her book down and thought about that. "Good," she said. "That's all?" "That's all." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary darkness. "You're not angry," he said. She considered it honestly. "I was, for a while. But anger is expensive, and I've got a grandmother to take care of, and a dog who needs his flank checked every other day, and apparently now I have to personally supervise the night shift's coffee situation, so." She picked up her book again. "I don't have a lot of budget left for anger." Something that might have been a smile moved through his expression and was gone. Ares rolled off the couch, padded over, and put his head on Saren's knee with the full, unself-conscious weight of a dog who had decided exactly where he was safe. "My people are calling us something," Harmon said. "I've heard." The wolf and his conscience. He said it with the particular dryness of a man who had opinions about nicknames. "Could be worse. It's reductive. Most things are. She looked at him across the coffee cups and the dog and the low light of the waiting room. Does it bother you? He thought about it, the honest version. No, he said finally, it doesn't. Saren Novak had come to the Meridian with steady hands, borrowed scrubs, and a checking account that felt like a countdown. She'd stayed because a wounded dog had looked at her face and made a decision, and because she'd discovered somewhere in the months between that first night and this one that she had a talent she hadn't known she possessed, not for medicine exactly, and not for the criminal world exactly, but for the particular space where frightened things decide whether to trust. It turned out that was useful everywhere. She scratched behind Aries' ear. The dog made a sound of complete contentment. What are you thinking? Harmon asked. That he used to flinch at everything, she said, and now he sleeps on the furniture. And she looked up, and that's usually how it goes. It's slow, and it's not a straight line, and then one day you look up, and the thing you thought was broken has just been figuring out how to be okay. A beat. The same goes for people. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her with increasing frequency. Not the cold cataloging look he turned on the world in general, but the other one. The one that still seemed to cost him something, like a muscle that ached when finally used. You could still leave, he said. It came out with the careful neutrality of something he'd rehearsed in his head many times. Your grandmother's care is handled. You have options now that you didn't have 8 months ago. Saren thought about that seriously, the way she tried to approach most things. I know, she said. But I'm not here because I have to be. She looked at Aries sprawled across her feet, like something that had never known fear in its life, which was the most beautiful lie and the most accurate truth she'd ever seen in the same moment. I'm here because whatever this is, it's ours. That's enough of a reason. Something in Harmon's expression went quiet. The distance he maintained with everyone, the thing he'd been losing ground on for 3 months, settled into something different. Not absence, just stillness. Aries' tail thumped once. Outside, the city went about its business. Graham Vick taught gun safety in the Arizona sun, and in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and decent coffee, the coldest man in the city sat with his dog and the girl who'd taught them both that survival and gentleness aren't mutually exclusive, that you can be dangerous and trustworthy, scarred and safe, a weapon and a partner, all at the same time. That's not a small thing. In a world like this one, that's almost everything. Before we go, I need to hear from you. If you'd been in Saren's position in that warehouse, would you have stepped between them? Would you have let Graham Vick walk out of that building alive? Or do you think some damage is too permanent to leave breathing? Tell me in the comments. And if you stayed until the very end, you already know what to do. Like this video, subscribe to Sadie's Romance Library, and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. There's always another story waiting in the dark. And the best ones, like Saren and Aries, never start the way you expect.